Hi, Sarah Maria. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.
And we're
Thanks for having me.
yeah, I'm a manager of diversity and inclusion of the Polyglot Conference in Budapest. And we thought it'd be a good idea to interview you because you live in Asia and you've learned many Asian languages and you also made a successful career out of languages. So yeah, it's so nice to have you here. And do you mind introducing yourself in Mandarin?
Ken 呀，我会给您介绍一下，我是韩梅，韩国的韩，梅花的梅，我是来自美国，就在中国大概4年了，特别对语言感兴趣。
Mhm. So that was a great introduction. And yeah, I will put subtitles in English. And so my question is, first of all, so could you tell us a little bit about your career path and how you managed to, yeah, develop a career out of your passion for languages?
Sure, yeah. So I have been interested in languages for a really long time. It initially started because I was so bad at learning them. I knew that I wanted to learn Spanish because it's one of my heritage languages. My father speaks Spanish. He's from El
Mhm.
Salvador. But I really struggled to learn it when I was growing up, and I didn't really understand why. I had so many friends that effortlessly spoke English and Cantonese and all their heritage languages, lots of immigrant families in my neighborhood. But for some reason, it didn't work for me. And so I think that was the initial impetus that made me interested in languages and how they work in the brain. So I
Mhm.
ended up studying linguistics in college, hoping
Mhm.
that I would get some answers from that. And it was really helpful.
Mhm.
The classes that I took taught me how language works in the brain. They taught me how languages change, taught me a lot about the structure of languages. And I think especially learning about the structure of languages, I was able to use that to sort of inform the way that I put together a study plan for myself. So that was really helpful. And then I guess my first career in language was I became really interested in psycholinguistics, so
Mhm.
how language works in the brain. And I ended up working in academia, working in laboratories that studied how language works. And my first job was working for a laboratory that studied Nicaraguan Sign Language. So it's
Mhm.
basically a really young sign language that's in Nicaragua that was giving us psychologists a really interesting way to study how language affects thought and vice versa. So that's a whole other story, but it was really cool. I did that for a few years, and that was my first career in language. Like the first time I got paid to
Mhm.
learn languages, and a big part of that job was learning Nicaraguan Sign Language so that we could
Mhm.
properly document it, learning other sign languages in the region. So for me, it was so much fun. It was the perfect job for a language lover.
Yeah.
And then I started a PhD. I thought that I wanted to become a professor and do research in
Mhm.
psycholinguistics and keep going down that path. I eventually realized I didn't really want to be in academia. I think that it's a great path for a lot of people, but for me, I didn't really want to be a professor. I didn't really want to teach. And I just really wanted to learn languages. I realized like that was really
Mhm.
what was giving me joy. And on one of my trips, one of these research trips, we brought along some professional interpreters. And
Mhm.
I was just so amazed by what they were doing.
Yeah.
It was so cool to see them practice in the evenings and, document all the new words that they were learning. And it was so cool to see their process.
Mhm.
So I decided to try to study translation and interpretation and see if I could
Yeah.
work in that career. So then I transitioned to being a freelance translator.
Mhm.
And that was really fun because as a translator, you are constantly learning new words because there's no way that you can already know all the words, even in your own
Mhm.
native language. So
Mhm.
you're being sent text to translate all the time that are on topics that are totally new to you, like machine parts or like Brazilian bikini patterns, stuff that like you don't know the words for. So
Yeah.
you're constantly learning new words. So that was also really gratifying. Then
Mhm.
from there, I moved to Korea and
Yeah.
I started getting all these requests for Korean translation, even though I didn't do Korean myself. My Korean was nowhere near good enough to do translation. So I started outsourcing those requests to other Korean
Mhm.
translators that I knew of. And that's where my company kind of grew out of. I was not expecting or planning to start a company, but it sort of grew from there. And then from there, I guess a few years later, we ended up pivoting into AI and data annotation. We already
Mhm.
had a big database of translators, and those people share a lot of the same skill sets that AI needs for data annotation. So
Mhm.
the company kind of pivoted to that. So you've seen I've had like several different pivots over the last like
Mhm.
10 years or 15 years of my career. But I've kind of managed to always have language be a part of it.
Yeah.
And I guess the reason why I tell this whole story is because I want people to see that there's so many different ways that you can end up in language. And there also doesn't ever have to be like a straight line, like a single career. Like you can really kind of try to see where your passions lie. And if you have skills in languages, there's so many different opportunities out there, especially now that AI is becoming so big. So many opportunities for people that love languages.
Hmm. Well, thank you for sharing your story. And some questions that I had was, did you have to go through a formal training to become an interpreter?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's a lot of different ways that you can be an interpreter or a translator. Some of the methods do involve formal training, some of them don't. I ended up doing training for translation. So in especially American English, and I think you already know this, but a lot of our listeners might not know, then people make a distinction between translation, which is for documents, and interpretation, which is for speaking. And they're often, not always, but often very separate career paths. So I ended up, after I did a little bit of interpretation, which I thought was really fun and really cool, I ended up gravitating more towards document translation because I liked that for document translation, you're not doing it on the spot. So you have time to really deeply research and like make sure that you can come up with the exact perfect sentence. And
Hmm.
that also means that you can do more languages because frankly,
Yeah.
for interpretation, you have to be functioning at such a high level in your languages
Hmm.
because you have to know on the spot what to say. That you can really, I mean, I think I know the person that I know that does the most languages would maybe be 4 or 5 for interpretation, and that's really, really rare. Usually people are doing 2 or 3, maybe 4. Whereas for translation, you can do a lot more languages because as long as you have access to the internet, as long as you have access to your dictionaries, then you're fine. So there's so many different paths. It'll really depend on what kind of translator, what kind of interpreter you want to do, you want to be. My training was at New York University. They had a certificate program that was specifically for training translators. You can also do master's programs, but there's also a lot of people that translate without having any kind of formal training. There actually aren't really any global accreditations.
Hmm.
Every country will have its own kind of requirements or accreditations, but it's different for everyone. So I would say, depending on the languages that you're working with, start Googling around if you're interested in this career path and try to find someone who's had a similar, who might have a similar path to you and see what kind of training they recommend.
Hmm. And some people worry that with the advent of AI and further development of AI, the job of translator will not exist in the future. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I'm actually pretty excited about the future of translation. I think that the job of of a translator is really changing. And the most important thing is if you want to be a translator, you have to be comfortable with technology.
Mhm.
And I think I was not someone that ever considered myself a tech person. Like I still don't know how to program at all. But it's actually a lot easier than you might think to find information on how to leverage this kind of technology. If you're going to be a translator in the future, you're absolutely going to have to work with machine translation. Machine
Mhm.
translation is getting better and better. I was very skeptical about it 10 years ago, and now I'm very, very excited about what it can do. And machine translation is going to make our jobs so much easier. It's basically,
Mhm.
it takes a lot of the grunt work out of being a translator. It basically
Yeah.
provides you with options and you just select the option that you feel is the best. It's much less typing. It's much more freeing the translator up to do the much higher level stuff. So the more of the artistic, more of the creative,
Mhm.
more of the, am I really sure this is the right context? Am I really sure I'm using the right honorifics? Rather
Mhm.
than just like looking up every single word in a dictionary. Not that you're ever looking up every single word, but uh, it's taking away a lot of the grunt work from being a translator. So the other really cool thing about that is that when I was starting in translation, it was actually really hard to make a career in any kind of creative realm. It was really hard to do
Mhm.
literary translation, poetry, because frankly, they wouldn't be able to pay me enough to make me be able to support my lifestyle because they don't have the kind of budgets that are necessary for the time that it would take me to translate. But now that it's so much faster to translate, since we have all these machines helping us, now translators can charge less. They can
Mhm.
do more, so you can still be making the same or higher income. But now we can take clients that didn't have the budgets for us before, so we can do more creative
Mhm.
stuff. So I think that's going to be really, really gratifying for a lot of people that maybe don't want to just do legal contracts all the time.
Yeah, that's really cool. So after working as a translator, you pivoted into language translation business manager, I guess. How would you call that job? It was more like a translation agency manager or
Well,
CEO?
I started the company, yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm the CEO of the company. It was a pretty smooth transition. I recommend it for a lot of freelancers that are looking to expand and want to create more passive income. Basically, just started delegating to other people. I found people that were much better than I was at all different kinds of roles. Building a website, doing marketing, doing the accounting, and then
Mhm.
eventually doing the actual translation. So yeah, so then I guess the role would be so I was first freelance translator. Then I guess you could say I was sort of like a project manager because I was starting to hire other translators to do the work. And then once I put together the formal entity of the company, then I really became a CEO and started
Mhm.
hiring project managers so that I wasn't even touching the management of the translation. I was hiring other people to do that.
Mhm.
So there's lots of different roles that you can work at a translation company. There's so many different, yeah, so many different positions that you can be interested in. And you don't even have to be a translator. You don't even have to speak another language fluently. Sometimes
Yeah.
even just having interest in languages can make you really successful in some of these other ancillary jobs at a translation company that aren't necessarily translation. So there's lots of
Mhm.
opportunities.
And what would you recommend young people to do in order to develop those business mindsets and different
That's a
skill
really good.
sets? Yeah.
Mm, that's a really good question. I guess for me, I just kind of threw myself into it and started Googling, and there's so much information online about how to start businesses, how to be an entrepreneur. There's, Udemy courses, there's people with YouTube videos and YouTube channels that talk about this. I also ended up calling a bunch of my friends that I knew had done similar things and just asking them for advice. I think probably the most useful one of the really pivotal moments in my life was I just sat down with someone who had been working as a freelance translator, and I asked her,
Mhm.
"How did you get started? How much did you charge in the beginning? How much do you charge now?" I asked her a lot of these. I'm really lucky that she answered all these very, personal questions very
Yeah.
openly.
Mhm.
Um, and that really set me off on the path. And then from there, I just Googled around and tried to find answers. I guess now it'll be maybe less Google and more ChatGPT. ChatGPT, how should I start my career in translation? But
Mhm.
there's so much information online. For a long time, I wondered, oh, should I have done a business school degree? Like, could I
Mhm.
have leveraged my career even further than that? I think there is a lot of benefit to a business school degree, especially in the connections that you make
Yeah.
and just a lot of the strategies that you'll learn, a lot of the way that it kind of teaches you to think.
Mhm.
But I didn't end up doing a degree, and I've also been told by many people that did do it, that for where I am in my career, it won't really be necessary because I've kind of already learned a lot of these lessons as I was
Mhm.
doing it.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's for every person, it's going to be a very personal choice if they have the resources to
Mhm.
pay for the business school degree. If they feel like they're still too new to the field and they need more experience, then that might be a good way to do it. Otherwise,
Mhm.
maybe just kind of throw yourself, start something small, start some small business and see what you're good at, see if you can find people to do the tasks that you're not good at,
Mhm.
and kind of take it from there.
Yeah, that's a great advice. And I also know that you have your personal projects called Miss Linguistic, right? So you have a blog. And can you tell us more about Miss Linguistic?
Yeah, so I think with the blog, it started just kind of as a way to try to answer the questions that my friends were asking me about how to learn languages. So I kind of ended up writing the same email over and over to friends that were asking for help, when they wanted to start a new language. And I thought, okay, I'll just start a blog and then I can send them the link to the article that addresses whatever
Yeah.
question that they have. And then I realized I was getting a lot of really cool and really supportive messages from people online that were interested in learning languages and said that it was helpful. And I just really wanted to write something that could kind of inspire people to learn more languages because I think when I was younger, for a long time, I just thought, oh, I just don't have the talent for it. It's just not something that I'm good at. So what's the point, And I want other people to realize, oh, there's so many different ways to learn a language. If I'm not being successful right now, maybe I'm not doing it the right way. Maybe there's another strategy that I can try. So I
Mhm.
just really want to like publicize that. And so yes, I'll put up like videos of me speaking different languages and stuff because I sometimes that's what it takes for someone to see someone who's speaking another language and then identify with them and be like, oh, okay, it's possible. For me, I
Mm,
had a lot of people that were like that. I remember watching videos by Benny Lewis and videos by Ollie
mm,
Richards, videos by Lindy Buttes,
yeah,
that I think, I remember there was a time when I thought there's no way that I can ever be fluent in Chinese. There's no way that I can ever be fluent in Korean. And when I watched these people speaking their languages, I thought, okay, someone else has done it. It's possible.
yeah.
So I'm really
Mm,
hoping that I can do the same with my blog and my videos.
yeah, that's really cool. And do you have any other careers in mind that you want to develop in the future? Or
That's a great question. Any other careers? Well, I think right now I'm in the middle of another sort of pivot, um, in which I'm really enjoying writing about languages. So I've always been
yeah.
interested in creating content about languages, but right now I'm interested in trying to write more in book form about languages. So I want to try to pass along some of the lessons that I've learned. Recently, I'm writing a lot about the value of dabbling in foreign languages. So I think a lot of people really find value in reaching fluency in one or two languages and just getting as far as they possibly can. And I think that's a really, really noble pursuit. And I did that for Spanish
Mhm.
and for Mandarin. And it's given me a lot of value. But I think there's also a lot of value in just learning a little bit of a lot of languages. There's so many
Mhm.
paths that opens up for you. And I think that for a lot of people, also reaching fluency is just not going to be possible. A lot of people don't have the time, they don't have the resources to reach fluency in a second language. Maybe they're not able to travel. And
Mhm.
I think it's okay. I think a lot of people have to they have to tell themselves it's okay if you don't reach fluency. There's still a lot of value that you can have
Yeah.
from even just a little bit of a language. And I want to validate people in that and show them the different ways that they can best leverage that.
Mhm. That's great. And another interesting thing about you is that you speak multiple Asian languages. And could you explain how you got into Asian languages?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, it's actually pretty simple. I was studying linguistics, and
Mhm.
they require you to take a language that's very different from English so that you can kind of
Mhm.
understand the structures of other languages that are out there. And so I was looking at Chinese and I was looking at Korean, but Korean was at 9 in the morning and Chinese was at
Mhm.
2 p.m. in the
Oh,
afternoon.
okay.
So, and I was a college student that was not about to wake up at 9 a.m. to study an
Yeah.
Asian language. So I ended up taking Chinese. I think that, like a lot of Americans, I grew up in a city that had a lot of Chinese culture, and so I was always kind of interested in that. I had a lot of friends that spoke Cantonese, some friends
Mhm.
that spoke Mandarin as their heritage languages. So it was something that felt really comfortable to me. And then after college, I went and I lived in Beijing for a few months and just really, really fell in love with it. It's a really cool city, really cool people. And that really launched me down the path of like spending a lot of time studying Chinese and becoming really immersed in that world. Then at some point, I met a boy who was going to Korea. I followed him to Korea, ended up marrying him there. He's not a
Oh.
Korean, but but he was working there, and
Yeah.
yeah. So now we're still married, and so that sort of set me down the path of becoming interested in Korean. And Korean had not been on my radar at all. I was very focused on Chinese, but it wasn't until I got there that I realized that first of all, it's a super interesting language, just really interesting grammar.
Mhm.
Um, Really, really interesting implications for basically the interplay between language and thought, so which it's a whole other topic that we could get into another time.
Mhm.
It's also just fun to learn a language that's really, really different from your own because it just forces you to think in
Exactly.
different ways, right?
Yes. Mhm.
So after I did Korean, I started studying Korean for a couple of years. And then to be honest, it really hurt my ego because Korean's really hard. I really
Yeah.
struggled with it. And then I heard from someone that Indonesian was really easy,
Hmm.
whatever that means for a language to be easy.
Yeah.
And so I ended up spending a lot of time in Bali and learning Indonesian. And indeed, it's true that it's easy to get to a conversational level in Indonesian. So, like within a couple weeks, I could have conversations that I could not even have in Korean. So that's definitely
Mhm.
true. I think for all languages, it's hard to reach fluency because there's always going to
Yes.
be some kind of give and take. There's always going to be some kind of trade-off for what's easy and what's hard about a language. But
Mhm.
it's true that Indonesian was very easy to reach like a really initial conversational level. So that sort of restored my faith in myself. Then I was able to go back to Korea and keep going with Korean. So I really recommend if you're a speaker of a Western or an Indo-European language, I really do recommend trying out some of the Asian languages, even though, I mean, to even say Asian language, it's what does that even mean? Because they're all so different
Mhm.
from each other. But I
Yeah.
guess what they have in common is they're all very different from English, and they're all very different from the Western languages. So you learn so much about the human brain. You learn so much about different ways of seeing the world. It helps you pay attention to different things in the world that you might not have noticed before. So I
Yes.
highly, highly recommend, even if it's a little bit
Mhm.
more effort in the beginning because you don't have a lot of the shared words,
Yeah.
it's completely, completely worth it.
Yeah. And do you have any tips on how to approach languages that are completely different from your mother or native
Mm.
language?
Ooh, on how to approach languages that are completely different. Yeah, I mean, I guess my strategy for most languages is more or less the same. I just have to tell myself and remind myself that if I'm making slower progress in a language that's very different from English, it's
Mhm.
just because of that. It's because we're not going to get any freebies. So like with Chinese
Mhm.
especially, it's very hard. You hear a new word, and if you see the character, you can guess because the way that characters are structured is semantic. But if you just hear a new word, you often just have no context for what it could be. Whereas if you're an English speaker and you're learning Spanish, a lot of the time you can kind of figure out from the roots what it might
Mhm.
be. So you just have
Yes.
to be a lot more patient with yourself. You need to be just ready for that initial phase where you just feel like there's no hooks to hang anything on. It's just really like having a lot more patience. And then I guess the other strategy that I think would be really useful is you really, and people, you'll hear this all the time, but you really, really, really cannot translate. You have to learn chunks. You have to learn
Mhm.
full sentences, because especially when you're first starting out, you're not going to have a good sense of what you can translate and what you can't. And you're going to try to put together a new sentence, and it's going to sound so totally weird to native
Mhm.
speakers. Um, Even if you think you're following all the rules that you've learned, there are just going to be certain sentences that you wouldn't say in that culture. Like it's just
Mhm.
not things you would say. So the best thing is to learn full sentences, just memorize full sentences. You can learn the structure later and kind of figure out why the sentence is structured that way later, but just start getting used to using set phrases.
Mhm.
Because I think that's the hardest part is that it's really hard to make new sentences in a language that's that different from your own.
Mhm. Yeah. That's a really great tip. And now let's talk about diversity and the polyglot
Mm.
community. So you've been involved in the community for a long time, right? When was the first time you discovered this
Mm.
community?
I think it was like around 2016 or 2017. I met a person here in Seoul who was really an impressive language learner, and he had already done a law degree in China, and then he had moved to Seoul, and then he was already speaking really incredible Korean. And so I was asking him, what are your secrets? Tell me everything. And he said that he loved following these online polyglots, and he followed all their channels, and he used a lot of their tips, and he used a lot of the apps and the software that they recommended. And so he sort of plunged me into that world. And then I found out about the conference, and I started going and meeting everyone and hearing about their strategies. So yeah, so I've been involved for a while now.
Mhm. And what do you think we can do to promote more diversity in this community? Or
Mm.
do you think, well, diversity is well represented in this community, first of all?
I'm really excited about the strides that are being taken now.
Mm.
I do think there's a lot more that needs to be done, but I'm really excited to see a lot of the stakeholders in the community, a lot of the conference organizers really paying attention to diversity.
Mhm.
Because, yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of natural and entrenched reasons why the community has not historically been very diverse. I think one of the biggest reasons is that I think the even just the word polyglot or even just the ability or the comfort with calling yourself a polyglot and saying I have these abilities, it's
Mhm.
something that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable.
Yes.
I think for me, especially as a woman, like I feel very uncomfortable introducing myself as a polyglot, or like saying, even when someone says, how many languages do you speak? I'm like, oh, well, what do you mean by speak? Like, I really want to
Yeah.
qualify everything. I don't want to
Yes.
I don't want to oversell my abilities,
Mhm.
God forbid. And I think that there are certain kinds of people in the world that are more comfortable with that. And so they
Yeah.
become overrepresented at these conferences.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, I think a lot of the time that means that men are overrepresented in in these conferences, Western men particularly.
Mhm.
And women are so much more often, they're so much more likely to say to me, if I tell my friend, oh, you speak a couple languages, like you should come to this conference, women will often be like, oh, I don't think that makes me a polyglot. I don't really count as a
Yeah.
polyglot. So I
Mhm.
really am trying to convince them, like, oh, no, it's not about, like, you're not being judged, you're not being measured in any way. It's really just about loving languages. And if
Mhm.
you don't get to that point, if you're not ready to make that leap, then yeah, then I guess what happens is you end up having conferences with a lot of one kind of person. And then of course it's funny because this is all about languages and it's all about
Yes.
learning new cultures and new languages. So you would think that
Mhm.
that would naturally lead to a lot of diversity, but it's quite the opposite.
Mhm.
But anyway, like I said, I think I'm really excited to see conference organizers really prioritizing the voices of women. So you're really seeing a lot more diversity on panels, you're fewer
Mhm.
males, and
Yeah.
then also really trying to do their best to make the conference affordable to
Yeah.
people from developing nations, and because that's also a really, really important part of, understanding the languages that are out there. If we're only
Yeah.
representing European languages, then you don't really have a
Exactly.
very good sense of what's out there in the world.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about the steps that are being taken. I think there's still a long way to go, but I'm
Yes.
glad that steps are being taken.
And also ethnic diversity as well.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, there's lots of different kinds of diversity, like, yeah, ethnic, minority languages I've noticed are also getting a lot of a spotlight shown on them. In Mexico, there was a really wonderful dedication to making sure that they were highlighting the indigenous languages of Mexico, and that
Mm.
was really exciting. I think a lot of people didn't know anything about the indigenous languages of Mexico, and they'd
Yeah.
come thinking
Yeah.
Spanish was the only language, and that was really, really helpful to see. So lots of different
Mhm.
kinds of diversity.
Yeah, that's great. So that's it for my questions. Thank you so much for this interview, and I hope to see you in Budapest.
Yeah, I hope to see you there too. And I really hope this is helpful to anyone interested in learning languages.
Yes.